Jackson. Would you give me that other pill there, please? Don't try too hard. Yeah, that's better. Does it hurt when you breathe? You say this came on suddenly?
Yes, he was all right when he came home from work. He ate a good dinner. We watched television for a while and went to bed early. And then about an hour ago, he woke up choking and coughing. He said he had a pain in his chest and he had trouble breathing. Is it his heart?
It could be. Looks more like pneumonia. We'll have to get him to a hospital right away. Better. I think we've stopped the buildup of fluid in the lungs, and he's breathing a lot more easily now.
Well, what caused it?
I don't know. Could be an infection. It looks like pneumonia, but it hasn't got the fever usually present. By the way, what type work does your husband do, Mrs. Carson?
Well, he works in a metal shop.
Mr. Stone, the mayor from the health department here to see you. Thanks. Oh, hello, Martin.
How are you, Roger?
Fine, fine. What are you doing out this way?
Checking on someone named Carsons.
Ike Carsons?
Yes. I understand he works for you.
Oh, that's right. I don't think he's here today, though.
He's in the hospital.
What's the matter?
Well, his doctor isn't sure. We think it could be nitrogen dioxide poisoning.
I don't see how he could have gotten it here. You know our exhaust system. You fellas helped us set it up. Joe? Is this where Carsons works? Yeah, when he's dipping. Weren't you working with Carsons yesterday?
Yeah, why?
All day?
Until about closing time, just about. That's when the power went off.
There was some trouble down the road. We lost our electric power for a while. Couldn't have been more than 10, 15 minutes.
We stopped dipping when the blower went out.
What about Carsons?
He had a few pieces to do. I guess he finished them. Anything wrong?
Plenty. Carsons is in the hospital.
I guess that's the answer.
I'm not sure. Now, Ike's been doing this work for years. He knows this stuff's dangerous. Besides, he couldn't have gotten much.
He wouldn't have to. You mind if I use the phone, Roger?
Use the one in my office.
I want to call Carson's doctor.
Today, everyone recognizes that certain kinds of work are more dangerous than others. Sometimes the danger comes from the conditions under which men work. Sometimes it's in the materials they use. But there are other hazards, too. Hazards even more dangerous, because they can't always be seen. And often, even when they are recognized, they're not taken seriously. Since most of these hazards are difficult to detect, many workers suffer daily exposure without even being aware of it. Today, it's becoming more and more obvious that almost every kind of work has its hidden health hazards. And these are steadily increasing as we go on to develop new processes and new materials. But there's nothing new about many of the hazards. Long before the birth of Christ, physicians knew that certain trades left their mark on workers. The miner's difficulty in breathing, the colic of lead workers, the tremors of mercury workers. They even developed devices to protect these workers. But ancient society had a simpler solution. It used slaves and criminals in the dangerous trades. The world saw many changes during the next 1,500 years, but the working conditions remained much the same. The only important difference was that now the work was done by free men, and there was more interest in protecting their health. During the 15th and 16th centuries, more people than ever before were working in the metal trades. And scientists began to take a special interest in the health of these workers. Agricola, in his scholarly study on mining and smelting, warned some of them,
"Miners should pay as much attention to ventilation as to digging. For when the air becomes stagnant, it causes them to breathe with difficulty, and sometimes they are even suffocated. Some mines are so dry that they are entirely devoid of water, and this dryness causes the workman even greater harm, for if the dust has corrosive qualities, it eats away the lungs and implants consumption into the body."
But mining was only one of the occupations of the time. And in the 17th century, Bernardino Ramazzini, an Italian physician, set out to study all of them. His studies merely confirmed what he already suspected.
Various and manifold is the harvest of disease reaped by certain workers from the crafts and trades that they pursue. All the profit they get is fatal injury to their health.
Ramazzini also offered a simple piece of practical advice to his medical colleagues.
When a doctor visits a working-class home, he should take time for his examination. And to the questions recommended by Hippocrates, he should add one more. What is your occupation?
Ramazzini appeared on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. But during this period of turmoil and upheaval, his historic work was forgotten, and working conditions dropped to a level comparable to the worst in ancient times. It was this wholesale maiming and poisoning of workers that again focused attention on the importance of protecting their health. Industry developed even more rapidly in the New World. And by the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had grown into an industrial giant. But working conditions were almost as bad as those during the early days of the Industrial Revolution. The lead trades showed how completely the health of the workers was ignored at this time. In 1912, in one group of mines and smelters employing some 7,400 workers, about 1,800 cases of lead poisoning were found. This didn't begin to represent the full number, because most plants didn't keep medical records. The mining and processing of lead was only the beginning. For the story was the same, or even worse, in all the trades that used lead products. More than 22% of the pottery workers suffered from lead poisoning. Silica dust, which had been a serious hazard since ancient times, was an even greater one in our country. More workers than ever before were being exposed to these dangerous particles without protection. And as a result, the crippling and often deadly disease of silicosis was common among thousands of workers. Phosphorus poisoning, another disfiguring and disabling industrial disease, was discovered in our match industry. When a government report revealed the extent of the disease, Congress placed a tax on white phosphorus matches, and the United States companies adopted the harmless substitute used by the European match industry. But the poisonous materials were not the only industrial health hazards at this time. Often, as in the case of the sweatshops of the garment industry at the turn of the century, They took the form of unsanitary conditions, overcrowding, and lack of ventilation. It took a tragic fire and an industry-wide strike to focus attention on this particular hazard. One reason industry could ignore the health of its workers at this time was the seemingly inexhaustible supply of immigrant labor. Each year, thousands of these workers poured into the country, anxious to find jobs and making no demands about the conditions. We know that many who remained suffered and died from their work. We don't know how many thousands returned to their homelands, crippled and broken in health. As a result of early government investigation, some states began to adopt compensation laws to protect their workers. And the United States Public Health Service established an Office of Industrial Hygiene and Sanitation to study the industrial diseases. There was plenty to study during these early days. For example, during the 1920s, there was a serious outbreak of radium poisoning in the watch industry. In one plant, there were 48 cases of radium poisoning with 18 deaths. In another plant, 20 died. 4 were chemists or physicists, and 16 were girls who painted the luminous dials. The radium was traced to the radium salts used in the luminous paint. The fact that most of these workers were stricken 4 to 7 years after they had left their jobs shows the slow and insidious way in which many industrial poisons work. Mercury was another widely used industrial material. The subtle, poisonous properties of this shimmering liquid metal had been known since the time of the Romans. Mercury poisoning in the felt hat industry and other trades had been notorious for centuries. It was the effects that mercury had on the mind that inspired eccentric fictional characters such as the Mad Hatter. As late as 1937, we found that more than 10% of our own hatters were suffering from mercury poisoning. Many of our old hazards continue to crop up in our newer industries. Lead, for example, was used to make petroleum products, rubber, and storage batteries. And in all these rapidly growing industries, lead poisoning began to appear. Some of the old hazards actually became worse under the influence of our rapidly developing technology. And as we became more aware of the nature of occupational health hazards, we began to find them everywhere. Farming, which had always been considered a healthy occupation, actually turned out to be a hazardous one. Farmers not only worked under extreme weather conditions, but they were also exposed to fungi and parasites and to the infectious diseases carried by farm animals. And with the increased use of chemicals and drugs on the farm, their work was steadily becoming more hazardous. We discovered that workers handling agricultural products were exposed to the same infectious diseases as farmers. And as industry expanded and new materials and processes were developed, more hazards began to appear. Some took the form of toxic dusts, which could produce skin irritations, systemic poisoning, and even cancer. Others appeared as fumes, mists, vapors, and gases, many of which could be deadly if the concentration were high enough. We discovered other health hazards in heat and noise, and in the widespread use of electromagnetic radiation. Although the problem of protecting the workers' health is actually greater today than ever before, we also have more to work with. For around the experience and knowledge painfully gained over the years, a whole new field of medicine, industrial medicine, has grown up. In schools of public health, more and more specialists are being trained. Physicians, chemists, physicists, toxicologists, engineers, hygienists, nurses, all preparing themselves to work in the different areas of industrial health. And today there are many organizations that need their services. Most of the civilian activity of the federal government is conducted by the Division of Occupational Health of the U.S. Public Health Service. The central office in Washington furnishes the overall direction for a national program. In addition to research on occupational health hazards and problems, this program provides training and technical assistance to state and local agencies as well as other groups. Most of this work is done at the division's research and training centers. Here, studies are continuously being made to discover the causes and effects of industrial diseases. Many of these studies, such as those measuring the stresses and strain imposed by work demands, go way beyond the more obvious effects of exposure. For example, one of these long-range research projects is studying the effects of industrial noises, not only on the worker's hearing, but also on his ability to learn and perform demanding tasks. The division's analytic laboratories have the highly specialized skills and the elaborate scientific equipment needed to study the many hazardous substances, new and old. And here, new methods of analysis are continually being developed to identify the harmful materials in the work environment. Once potentially dangerous substances are identified, further studies are made in the toxicology laboratories to determine just how harmful they are. These are the kind of studies that help establish the safe tolerance levels for workers. And here, too, new tests are developed to detect early signs of poisoning. In other laboratories, dermatoses or skin irritations of all kinds are carefully studied. A large amount of research goes into this problem because this is the most common industrial disease. The division's engineers and other specialists also serve as consultants to governmental agencies, industry, and labor. And many professional people already working in occupational health attend their training courses. The division also sponsors research by educational institutions and private organizations throughout the country. But it is the state governments that are directly responsible for the health of their workers, and today practically all of them have occupational health programs. And they usually require a large staff of trained workers. These specialists work directly with industry not only to control any existing hazards, but to prevent new ones from developing. Often their preventive work begins in the blueprint stage, before the plants are even built. Almost all state offices have their own laboratories where industrial materials are analyzed and harmful substances can be quickly identified. State industrial hygienists are constantly on the watch for dangerous substances in concentrations that could be harmful. Many large plants have their own programs to prevent occupational disease and injury and assure prompt treatment when they do occur. And with such programs, they have been able to establish outstanding records in occupational health. Although most of these plans were originally limited to periodic physical examinations and first aid, today almost all of them have been expanded to include general preventive health services. In smaller plants, the medical department often consists of an industrial nurse who provides emergency care, health counseling, and education, and a part-time plant physician who visits the plant periodically for examinations. Some plants use only a part-time nurse, but most of them have no medical facilities or services at all, depending largely on the state and local health agencies for occupational health guidance and supervision. Insurance companies have played an important role in helping reduce health hazards in industry. They not only do research, but they also provide consultation for the plants they insure. Some unions have their own health centers, which are primarily concerned with the general health of their workers. And some of these centers have industrial health specialists on their staffs. But most workers still rely on their private physicians for health guidance and treatment. And this means that, whether he's aware of it or not, he serves as an industrial physician. Most of his patients work. And since almost every kind of work has its health hazards, he cannot afford to ignore his patient's occupation in making his diagnosis. Also, since this is the only examination most workers receive, he has an opportunity to spot the symptoms of industrial disease early. And if these are immediately reported, the hazards that produce them can be eliminated or controlled before large numbers of workers are affected. By consulting with the local industrial health specialists, the doctor also avails himself of their experience and knowledge in this area, along with the special equipment and laboratory facilities they have at their disposal to help identify industrial diseases. When the private physician recognizes this role and tries to fill it, he not only helps his patient, but he also performs an important public service. Investigation and troubleshooting are still major and essential activities in occupational health. But today, more and more emphasis is being placed on anticipating industrial hazards and controlling or eliminating them before they can damage the worker's health. Perhaps the best example of how effective this preventive method can be is the phenomenal safety record that we have achieved in the field of atomic energy. We knew the hazards were there, and health protection was a primary consideration in the development of this vast new field from the very beginning. The fact that we have been able to use these highly dangerous materials without damaging the health of workers graphically demonstrates the ability we've developed to control almost all occupational hazards. We know how to control most of the old hazards today, and we've already established standards and threshold limits for many of them. Now it's largely a matter of education and putting this knowledge to work. Furthermore, with the experience that we have gained working with the old hazards, we are in a better position than ever before to control the new ones as they appear. These accomplishments show how far we have come in many areas of occupational health. But we still face many problems. New equipment and methods dig and cut faster, but they also produce more dust. And so we still have silicosis. In small, unsupervised plants, poisonous materials such as lead are still used with little or no consideration for the danger to the worker, and we still have diseases such as lead poisoning. What makes this even more appalling is that the majority of our industrial workers earn their living in small plants. The huge chemical, petroleum, and plastics industries continue to turn out their steady stream of new materials. We know that many of these are potentially toxic. We also know that many will be used without any concern for the hazards involved. Many of these new materials will be used by agricultural workers in the form of insecticides and feed supplements. We know these chemicals will work wonders in destroying insects and fattening animals. But what about the men who continually use them with little or no protection? Other hazards, such as noise and heat, have been recognized for many years, but we still don't know precisely how they affect man or how much men can safely take without damaging their health. Automation and mechanization are rapidly being adopted by industry. But what about the men who must control these complex mechanical systems? Mental and psychological strain, we know, can be very real hazards. And what is the effect of our industrial environment on the steady and alarming increase in chronic diseases? For while the deaths from communicable diseases have steadily dropped since the turn of the century, the death rate from chronic diseases has sharply climbed. These and many other questions in occupational health remain to be answered. And before we can answer many of these questions, we need more accurate information that will help us determine the true extent of industrial diseases. Information that will also help us locate and identify the new hazards before they assume catastrophic proportions. And yet, not many more than half of our states require the medical reporting of industrial diseases, and only a few states actually receive more than 100 reports a year. Another serious problem that occupational health still has to contend with is the shortage of trained, capable people to work on these problems. Occupational health needs many times the number of people it now has. All these are problems that we, as a great industrial nation, cannot afford to ignore, for the cost could be staggering. And as we attack these problems, and new ones as they appear, we move closer to the day when all men will be able to work without endangering their health or their lives.